I've often quoted as saying I would rather be governed by the first 2,000 people in the Boston Telephone Directory than by the 2,000 people on the faculty of Harvard University.
In this present crisis, government is not the solution to our problem. Government is the problem.
They share our beliefs, our convictions, our hopes, and our dreams. These are the conservatives of the heart. They are our people.
Join the best in the movement. It's Conservative Conversations with ISI, educating for liberty since 1953.
Welcome back. You're listening to Conservative Conversations with Johnny and James. Today we're joined by ISI faculty member, Director of Academic Programs for the Witherspoon Institute, and editor of the Public Discourse, R.J. Snell. Dr. Snell, thanks for joining us.
So good to be with you. Thank you, Johnny. Thank you, James. Good to be speaking with ISI again.
Awesome. So, Dr. Snell, today for our listener question, we have a question from Michael. And Michael's interested in fiction books from great conservative thinkers, Kirk, Buckley, etc. And he asks, what role does or should fiction play in the conservative movement? And what are your conservative fiction recommendations?
Yeah, thank you, Michael, for that question. That's an interesting one, isn't it? There's a famous book, which I'm sure many of us have read, by Richard Weaver, Ideas Have Consequences. I remember reading it as a young student and being kind of captivated by the idea. And I think Weaver is still correct that bad ideas have bad consequences. The older I get, I'm probably less susceptible to the idea that just good ideas fix things on their own. And I'm increasingly convinced that good ideas, while they have to be understood and we have to continue to promulgate good ideas, just as important, if not more important, for the conservative movement and indeed for individuals and themselves, is the formation of attitudes and dispositions and loves. And fiction does an amazing job of allowing us to sympathize with a world which is not our own, to sympathize more deeply with the world that is our own, to understand a place. What I'm trying to say here is to form our affections and our attachments. Just a couple of weeks ago, I finished reading a novel that my 9-year-old daughter has been after me for weeks and weeks to read, Swallows and Amazons by Arthur Ransom. I guess it's a classic. There's a big series. All my children have read it. I never got around to dealing with it. And it's a story set in the Lake Cottage of Britain. And there's this group of young children who want to go and camp on an island by themselves without parents and sail their little boat, the Swallows, right? And they're the Swallows. And they write away to their father, who's a naval officer. He's not around. Are they allowed to do this? They telegraph, and they receive a telegram back saying, only duffers drown. If not duffers, won't drown. And their mother sees this as permission. So they go on their adventures. They camp, they sail, they have raids with their, the enemy ship, and they live this deeply imagined world during their vacation time. Now, the story really is about freedom and about a community which values freedom and interdependence. Now, I can't think of something that's much more conservative than a community which values freedom and interdependence, right? Not sheer dependence, but interdependence. You help me, I help you. We work together within an aura of liberty where they were unafraid of the adventure of life. Now, I think of that as a pretty sound conservative tale, actually. People have different opinions about COVID, and there's different levels of risk tolerance. And, I don't want to sort of get into that, but we have seen a ongoing sense in the West and in the American mind that we're afraid of risk. And we would like a solution of the technical sort. And the idea that life is an adventure and a pretty glorious one, and it will entail some risk, but it's okay because there is a community of interdependence willing to support each other in that risk. That's a pretty good conservative story. So I think fiction is pretty important for the conservative imagination and for conservative dispositions. And, I use that classic children's story, new to me, just as an example of that. I think there's actually a fair amount of children's fiction which reveals that kind of disposition. Even something like Wind in the Willows, right? You have an adventure, you have a thick community, it values locale and patterns, values community. So, Michael, I would suggest going back to good children's fiction, and there's a lot there.
Dr. Snell, do you think that is a, conservatives perhaps getting away from, the building out their imagination, immersing themselves in fiction, and sort of focusing on a more politicized existence? Is that particularly unique to conservatives, or do you really see that as maybe a seismic shift that engulfed sort of left and right in the United States, and conservatives are just suffering from their unique kind of variety of that sickness?
Yeah, it's hard for me to know whether or not this is peculiar to us or not, but our conservatives' experience of the loss of that imagination is particularly poignant for the conservative experience. If you sort of look at the kind of Trillings of the world from an earlier period, the kind of Columbia experience, obviously literature plays an enormous role in the liberal imagination, right? That's how Trilling thinks about it. And that imagination has changed too. And I guess we're going to talk about this later, but at least how I understand conservatism, it assumes a kind of disposition to the world. Everything assumes a kind of disposition, but our disposition, I think, begins with a sense of reverence and gratitude. And to lose the sense of gratitude and place and custom is at least peculiarly poignant for a conservative to lose. I'm not sure it's unique to us, but it has its own mode of affecting us.
Yeah, I mean, I think that those are great points, and I remember one of the times. So, obviously, as you know, Dr. Snell, I went to the Templeton Honors College, and Templeton Honors College are very much formed by literature throughout. Graham Greene and Evelyn Waugh were particularly formative for me. But I remember one time, I never really understood why fiction in particular was so formative until I read Kirk's essay on moral imagination. And that sort of draws the line between idyllic imagination, moral imagination, diabolic imagination. And I started to think wow, I really need to stop watching Netflix and need to read more Dante.
Good sound advice in any age, actually.
Yes, absolutely. So now we'll move to our books of the week. Dr. Snell, what are you reading right now?
Well, I just tipped my hand with Swallows and Amazons, so I'm reading Swallows and Amazons. But, for the last little less than a year, a group of friends and I have been every Tuesday chatting together about Balthasar Gracian's The Pocket Oracle and the Art of Prudence. I don't know if you've ever heard of this book. It's a collection of 300 aphorisms. He's a 17th century Jesuit, sometimes referred to as the Jesuit Machiavelli. You can make of that what you will, the Jesuit Machiavelli. And I wouldn't suggest that all of Gracian's advice is sound advice. There's aspects where I think, I don't know if that probably is immoral or sinful, but it is a masterclass of human behavior. Louis Tellis, who's the president of Witherspoon, occasionally he'll tell all the staff here, look, we do a lot of things. We work in education, we work in publishing, we work in research, but our main task, what we can't forget, is to study humanity. If we're actually going to be able to reach students, if we're going to be able to promulgate our ideas, we have to study humanity. So Gracian's advice here is a masterclass in human motivation, about how to understand why other people do what they do, how to understand how you can succeed, the kind of character that you need to have, when to not take offense, when to let things slide, when to be resolute, how to have self-respect, how to be judicious. A lot of it really just is about how to have sound judgment. So I've been dealing with this for the better part of a year, and I think it's really quite wonderful and something of an underread classic.
Well, wonderful. We'll definitely link that in the show notes for anyone who wants to check it out. Johnny, what are you reading right now?
Yeah, I have been on a presidential biography kick. Just finished a Lincoln biography and began The Rise of Teddy Roosevelt by Edmund Morris, which I'm actually listening to on audiobook. So just at the point where he was elected to be the minority leader in the state house in New York. So a young, 24, 25-year-old Roosevelt is who I'm dealing with now in my mind. So
Have you ever read any of his writings about being on the ranch or hunting or any of that? And he was quite the guy, just this large soul.
So I've read a little bit of what you're describing, but I mean, yeah, it strikes me that there's not, I haven't really encountered, I don't think, another American sort of political figure since maybe like Alexander Hamilton, who I think has just the energy of Teddy Roosevelt, and sort of his life out west is just sort of, I mean, the stories are just kind of like hilarious and ridiculous. And this all kind of began when he was a child. I mean, he would basically, he would attach animals, like he would chain like a giant snapping turtle in the kitchen, to the base of the sink and just leave it there. And then like the house cleaner would be like, Teddy, you can't have a snapping turtle in the sink. And then like she'd come in the next day and he was boiling a possum, and he'd say, no, you have to let the possum boil for 24 hours. And she's like, and he did this like all through college. Like this was just like normal to him, it's strange, but yeah, he was quite the character.
Isn't at one point on his political career, he's given a stump speech and he gets shot and he finishes the speech before he goes and gets medical care? Isn't that a true?
So he got shot. Not only did he get shot, this was when he ran, on the Bull Moose, for the Bull Moose party. I think he was up in Wisconsin. I think it was Milwaukee, actually. And he gets shot. And I think it goes through, actually, I think his speech was still in his pocket at that point. I think it went through the speech, he kind of held up the bloody speech and then proceeded to talk for over 40 minutes, bleeding out on stage. And it wasn't until he was pale that like they dragged him off and took him to the hospital. So
that's Teddy.
Yeah, it's Teddy.
There you go.
What about you, James?
Well, I just started, I was sort of in I don't know if you guys have ever been in this space, but a space where I had too many books sort of partially read and was feeling drawn by all of them and didn't know what to do. And so I decided that the best thing to do was to take a step back and just pick one and go for it and stop, reading each for an hour. And so I'm reading the the intellectual biography of Robert Nisbet that ISI put out a number of years ago, because Nisbet seems to me to be a pretty central figure right now in the movement. And so it's been interesting. I've just started. I've just sort of gotten through his life and some of his early years. But I'm excited to see where it takes me and how it changes how I read, Quest for Community or Twilight of Authority or any of those books.
What's the title of that? I don't know that book.
It's just called Robert Nisbet. I'm trying to think of what the subtitle is. I don't have it right next to me, but I will put a link to it.
It's part of that series. Like you guys did a Vogelin history, and yeah. Because I've read a fair amount of Nisbet,
exactly.
But I don't know anything about him. As a person or his studies, I don't know. Yeah, that series, right?
There it is.
Go, Brad Lowell Stone.
Yeah. And I mean, we have a Whitaker Chambers one. I think Mises. I think one on Myers in the works. Right. We have a lot of these figures.
Great. Well, we'll have to check that out, and James can link to that in the show notes. Before we get to the formal part of the interview, a brief word about our show. This podcast is a production of the Intercollegiate Studies Institute. Our mission at ISI is to educate for liberty. If you'd like to help us pursue that mission, please rate and review this podcast on Apple Podcasts or wherever listeners like you tune in. All right, Dr. Snell, why don't we kick things off with you telling us a little bit more about the Witherspoon Institute and Public Discourse. Why was it created and what does it do?
Yeah, thank you very much. So I'm relatively new to Witherspoon. I was at the Templeton Honors College where James had been for quite some time, and I came to the Witherspoon Institute in 2016. Witherspoon was founded in the early 2000s. It's sort of a think tank. It's adjacent to Princeton, but not part of Princeton. So it's kind of a think tank / educational center. It does work, in its early days, it did a lot of work on the family, on the social costs of pornography, nature of marriage, kind of the social issues. In more recent years, while it continues to do some of that, it's become much more educationally focused. So we do summer programs for everything from high school students through medical students and law students. During the academic year, we run multiple seminars a week, voluntary, non-credit, for Princeton students, ranging in everything from literature and poetry through political classics and texts on market economy. We're committed to the idea that institutions matter. And we take the long view of things, which is to try and reseed institutions, particularly but not only the university, by forming faculty members. So the Witherspoon family, it's very much a federalist model that everybody's independent, but we have 22 centers like us at various universities. So Princeton, Harvard, Yale, Columbia, Duke, Chicago, Rice, Cambridge, Oxford, Berkeley, Stanford, each with their own genius. So we're non-confrontational. We don't sort of throw mud or rocks at university or faculty. We're deeply committed to the idea of collegiality and friendship. Our student groups here, for instance, this last year was a little awkward, but the year before, we had one group that had the leader of the campus Republicans and a leader of the campus Democrats sitting around at a dining room table, having lunch and reading texts. So we're still committed to the idea of long, slow conversations around primary texts about the questions which matter most, trying to reseed the basic institutions. So we're very much institution builders. We try to form friendships with faculty members, mainly at elite universities, not all of whom agree with us on everything, but if they agree with us that you could still have a conversation about a book and about things that matter, they're friends of ours. Public Discourse is the online journal of the Witherspoon Institute. We try to thread the needle between academic publication and pure popular publication. Many, but not all, of our authors will be academics, and we're trying to get them to, in an intelligent, reasonable, moderate way, translate the best of the arguments from the academy about markets, about family, about education, about human person and dignity, in a way which is accessible to an interested and intelligent reader. So not overly specialized, not jargon prone. We think that tone matters an awful lot. And we don't take editorial positions on a whole lot of things. We think the Overton window of acceptable conversations is pretty broad, and we still think that you can argue it out, and that's okay.
I want to ask, obviously ISI is sort of working in the conservatives and higher ed realm to some extent, and so is Witherspoon. One thing I'm wondering is, how should conservatives define like the sort of end game or the goal in higher education? Because it can happen at many levels with student groups or with academic programs for undergrads or for funding for faculty members. So how would you define that end game?
Yeah, I think there actually needs to be a variety of end games. I don't think we should put all of our eggs in one basket, and I don't think we should diminish the approaches of other institutions. We can do good things in various ways, and institutions like ours don't need to step on each other's feet or diminish the approaches of other institutions. There's lots of good ways. So one way that happens is what I like to think of as a parallel university. You bring students together, maybe from a variety of universities. You put them together for a week or a weekend, and you read something that they might not otherwise get. You try to fill in the lacunae of the university. It's like a parallel university. There's something like the parallel college model. So thinking here like residential college, where you try to get students from the same institution together repeatedly. That's more of our model, where we're trying to work with the exception of our summer programs, we're trying to work with students from Princeton. This is Witherspoon. And we have 3, 4, 5 seminars a week. We're trying to get not one big event, with 300 people where they hear a lecture and then disperse. We're trying to get them together again and again and again and again to learn to trust each other and form a kind of collegial friendship, and to learn an arc of an argument or an arc of a history. We think of that as reseeding the university. We're trying to find faculty members around whom we can help build programs. We're trying to find individuals like myself who are not members formally of the university, but near it, who will form friendships with faculty members, with students, and in essence, rebuild a kind of conversation and a certain content of conversation that's not going on. We do the same thing with postgraduate work. We're part of the Barry Scholars Program network, which is sending students to Oxford for a year with just a little more money than the Rhodes provides. The Witherspoon family has a considerable number of postdoctorate fellowships now, where we're trying to get good people back into university positions. So we think of that as reseeding. That's one end game. I mean, I myself don't think that the major research universities are going to change their tune. Like, I don't think there's some grand victory coming where the boards take over and, the imbalance ratio between Democrats and Republicans, progressives and conservatives is fixed. Not anytime soon. What we can do is find good people willing to host good conversations for those who want to have them, and give the best kind of education available to those who have. But there's other models, but that's ours, and we think it's a profitable one.
And Dr. Snell, what is your, does the Witherspoon Institute in particular, is it more of an informal network where you're partnering with comparable institutes at these other, top elite schools, or what is the formal, is there any sort of cross institution strategizing going on, or is that are you more independent on each campus?
Yeah, a bit of both. So all the various institutes are independent. They have their own boards and presidents, their own genius of how they operate. But there's a lot of cross-pollination. There's students going back and forth. The directors of the various institutes are in close conversation. We get together from time to time and work together. There's a lot of study of the situation, what's going on. And we have kind of sectors. So our family has several institutes that are working in bioethics and medical student education. We have several institutes that are working on civics, broadly construed, others that are doing political philosophy or philosophy, others doing economics. So they're not all identical. Part of it is the opportunity at a various university, and some of it's just the faculty and friends that we have.
Yeah. Well, one thing we'd love to talk to you a little bit more about today is the editorial that Public Discourse recently put out, I guess it was a couple months ago now, called Toward a New Consensus. One of the things that I wanted to sort of start out with is you use this phrase in there, or the editorial team uses this phrase in the piece, locked in argument together. What do you mean by that phrase, and how can that be practiced in everyday conservative discourse?
Yeah, thanks for that question. So the editorial came out the first day that I was editor-in-chief of Public Discourse. So Public Discourse was founded and run admirably for many years by Ryan T. Anderson, who's still a contributing editor of the journal. But when he went to EPPC, the demands on him were just too significant to be able to continue to run Public Discourse day to day. So in the first day that I was editor-in-chief, we released this statement. It's co-signed by all the contributing editors. There's a lot of language that the old consensus is dead. I mean, conservatism is full of argument right now, which if you're optimistic, you think, oh, look how lively the intellectual movement is, right? There's so many arguments. If you're a pessimist, you say, oh, it's all falling apart, and you start talking about Reagan zombies, or, you pick your enemy and think it's all sort of splintering. I'm open, of course, to the idea that the old consensus, let's say, post-World War II options, we have got to repaint the fence from time to time. You can't just keep saying the same old thing in the same old way. Context changes, circumstances change. But I myself am not especially open to the idea that conservatives should form a circular firing squad, and because we think differently on this or that issue, and we do, and that's fine, that we have to accuse others of ill faith or unintelligence or selling out the cause or something like that. So in that statement, we don't define what we think the new consensus content will be, but rather what the issues that we need to figure out, what they are. And what we invite everyone to is what I'm still committed to, even though others think this is somewhat passé, is the old John Courtney Murray notion from which that line is taken, that human beings can in fact form a conspiracy. Right? Now, the etymology of conspiracy is being close enough to breathe together or breathe the same air, right? Spire, to spirate is to breathe. Conspiracy is to breathe the same air, right? You're so close that as you exhale, they inhale, right? This is how an argument works. It goes back and forth. You make your claim, I make my counter, you make your counter, etc. I think good people of goodwill can lock themselves together in argument. We can disagree. It doesn't mean we need to declare Twitter war on each other. It doesn't mean we need to take cheap points against each other. It means it's time to get busy and argue. Disagreement is a real accomplishment, actually. Productive disagreement is a real accomplishment.
It is, and I think you guys are doing a fantastic job at it too. I really do think the profile of I just speaking of Twitter, both on the virtues and vices, but one of the virtues is that I feel like I've been seeing public discourse articles sort of at the top of my feed, perhaps more than in the past. So I think you guys have done an excellent job of sort of maintaining this conversation and this dialogue.
Before we move on to our next question, I just wanted to give you a brief message from a friend of ISI, the Conservative Minds podcast. What does it mean to call yourself a conservative? Where did the conservative movement come from, and where is it going? In a time of ideological realignment and uncertainty where social media sniping replaces measured discourse and debate, people are left to wonder, which values and ideas define American conservatism? On the Conservative Minds podcast, join Corey Astle and Kyle Salmon as they answer these questions and more by reading political authors from the past and present and discussing them in a fast-paced, free-flowing conversation. To listen, go to conservativeminds.fireside.fm or find it on your regular podcast provider. All right, let's get back to the interview.
A lot of the disagreements, I think, in conservatism today have to do with the means of how we sort of pursue ends. There's big critiques of procedural liberalism going on, things like that. And so I hear a lot of, and maybe this is certainly my perspective of speaking to mostly younger conservatives, but some older conservatives too, I think. And one thing that I hear them say a lot is, means are not the priority. Means don't really matter. We need to be particularly interested in achieving the ends that we agree on, and we can employ whatever means necessary to get there. So have you encountered that sentiment at all in your own work, and how do you respond to something like that?
Yeah, and there's variants of that. There's a weaker version and a stronger version of that. The weaker version is, please, let's not get overwhelmed in the niceties of procedure. Let's win elections. Let's get appointments. Let's do politics. I think of that as a weaker or softer version of it, which is just a kind of pragmatic sense of, look, at some point you got to win an election, and you have to have Supreme Court justices. The stronger version of that, or the harder version of that, is something like, look, our commitment to ends is foolish. It's about power. Let's get power. Let's use power. And the truth of the ends is not really all that important. Neither is the truth or the morality of the means. Now, the hard and the soft variant are not the same thing there, right? So, I'm a philosopher, right? I'm sort of prone to sort of thinking, yeah, sure, it works in practice, but does it work in theory? I'll take the correction of those who are committed to the softer version of that and say, yeah, that's right. At some point, we can't all just have a monkish understanding of education. We need to actually affect change in the world for the better and for the common good. The harder version of that, I'm pretty opposed to. Politics is not simply about wresting power from your enemies and giving it to your friends in a way which is immune to or willing to play loose with moral and constitutional procedures. I'm not so friendly to that idea.
And on that latter point, do you think, I'm trying to think of some of those, I guess the ends in particular that would be pursued, because I do feel like there's there has been kind of a sort of the own the libs mentality, I guess. It's sort of regardless of what the content is, sort of, you can kind of 10 years ago you can imagine, or 20 years ago, like it's just a different iteration of this kind of repeating over and over again. Is what you're seeing, do you think, different than that? Just sort of, is there anything new emerging right now in what you're describing about people, I guess, wanting to, reward friends and punish enemies? Or is it just kind of the same old own the libs, but, circa 2021?
Yeah, of course, the various forms of social media and so on is conducive to a kind of performative governance, right? We don't actually have to govern. We sort of think of life as, high school student council. And if you kind of get the dig in and get a few likes that you've done something, that's performative governance. And, that hasn't really changed so much. It's just we have new technical means of doing so. I do see among certain type of conservative a sense of Gramsci was right. The old Marxists were right about how power is operationalized. And the truth of things is less important than the operationalization of power. I think this is still rare, but you can find it. And I think that's deeply concerning.
Yeah, where do you think that started, at least on the right? Because when I look back at like Kirk and Buckley and Meyer and these guys who were writing in the 60s, 70s, 80s, they're not necessarily using that same language on the right. In fact, in some instances, they explicitly reject it. And so, I mean, yeah, what was it that has led some conservatives to talk more in terms of power? And I think class is another important category that some new conservatives have adopted.
Well, I think there's a variety of explanations on that. I don't know which one is true, but I can see how it would work for various people. So there are those who think that particularly in cultural issues, conservatives have just been defeated, right? We've taken a shellacking. And we took a shellacking because the long march through the institutions was a pretty good theory. Like if you ever read Antonio Gramsci, he's not doing Marxism really on economics. He's doing Marxism by institutions and how institutions form minds and hearts, and then, in the end, economies. The long march through the institutions on the left has been pretty successful. If you think that we've lost the culture war and you see a model which allowed your intellectual opponents to win, you might think, well, let's just follow that model. Let's do what they did because it works. So, that's one possible explanation that you see that people do. Another possible explanation is just the pervasive sense. It's everywhere in our society. It's everywhere in our education, from primary through postgraduate education, that politics really is about power. It's just how people have been trained to think through these things. It's the first impulse for many. And so it becomes a cultural norm. I could see that being a possible explanation, for at least for some. I think there's a lot going on here. I would hate to reduce it to one.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, that makes sense to me. One thing, I don't know if you know David Corey, but he was giving a talk for our honors students a couple weeks ago. And one thing he talked about was reducing the Telec nature of politics and how that can actually help keep us from thinking of politics in terms of power and in terms of sort of warfare.
He's very good at that.
Yeah.
I think too. I've been reading a lot of Oakeshott lately. His essay "Rationalism in Politics." We've become accustomed to thinking that there's a technical solution for things, and so we don't actually. This is sort of it's not disagreeing with David, but it's almost the inverse of it, but in a different way. We don't think about the ends. We think merely about the procedural means, and then we fight about the procedures. I think David's warning here, which is a good one, is don't make politics the first and ultimate thing, right? As if it's the telos. So oddly, we've made politics the telos, but then we haven't thought about the we haven't thought about the telic nature of the human within an ordered life. So politics becomes both too much. It's all encompassing in people's lives. And when we do politics, we think of it as mere technique or power.
Yeah, I would love to just sorry, Johnny, and then I'll let you get to your question. There's this line from the editorial that I loved. You write, still, politics is not the most important thing. Politics is neither first nor ultimate. In the end, human fulfillment and happiness lie beyond the political and are attained only in the kingdom of God. Consequently, a sound politics is not totalizing. I think that really, really describes very well the how we ought to view politics.
Yeah, thank you. Appreciate that.
Yeah, and so I guess, Dr. Snell, are there other ways? We talked a little bit about literature and sort of the imagination. Are there other ways that we can sort of reduce I guess if we're thinking in terms of power, how do we, what are the counterweights that can sort of dethrone the the reign of the all-consuming totalizing nature of politics? What are some of the other things that we can use or employ to elevate, I don't know, the other ends that deserve to be higher?
Yeah, you can't go a day in reading about politics before you hear someone decrying a polarization of society and wishing that everything was sort of nice. And I guess that's okay, but politics has always been a little bit red in tooth and claw, or it's not just circling and sharing all of the time. Oftentimes when people talk about trying to make politics more bipartisan, more friendly, less polarized, they think about it merely in the domain of ideas again. I tend to think we need to be utterly concrete about this stuff, which is to value place and community and family and friendship more than we do. COVID has really demonstrated what a lot of social scientists have been talking about for some years now, which is the epidemic of loneliness in America. An enormous number of people don't have a single friend that they can really rely on. They don't feel tied to place. They're anybody's who can move anywhere without thick attachments and roots. Now, we're not going to solve that. We're going to have a liquid society. We're going to have a mobile society. Young people are going to go to college and then go to London and then go to Hong Kong and then come back home for a weekend and then move on. But the disposition or the virtue that we need to form, despite the mobility and the liquidity, is a sense of the rhythm or the pattern of human life. You need to know your neighbors. You need to have a backyard barbecue. You need to have a dance at your parish. You need to get out of the backyard and onto the front porch and into the street. That's very concrete. Something that my wife and I do, we weren't able to do it last October, is we have an Oktoberfest in our backyard. We bring in musicians who play old line dances and contra dances. We've got, 120 to 160 people in the backyard eating brats. And you've got little kids dancing with old people, friends with friends, a grandpa with a granddaughter, a professor with a student. That's pretty concrete. And I'm shocked to discover how many people will tell me that will be the only party like that they'll go to that year. How can that be? Well, it's easy to be on your laptop or on your phone fulminating about politics, where politics becomes kind of a form of entertainment. And, the rage levels rise, and it's easy to see the worst of the other side because you didn't invite them over to your backyard for a dance. The old patterns of community life are broken in so many places. The parish dance, the parish picnic, the neighborhood festival. Those things are not that difficult to do, and they are a genuine and humane politic.
And I think that's really what to kind of go in a theological direction, that's what the whole liturgical life of the church is designed to do, sort of to bind the local parish and the people that live in the village or the neighborhood around it into a cycle of feasting and fasting together in community. And the liturgy itself, there is I'm Eastern Orthodox, so there's a line right before the Eucharist about let us now lay aside all earthly cares, and it repeats over and over again. It's like 10 or 15 times, and I always catch I hear it. And then I start thinking about work or a deadline or a proposal. And, I serve in the altar. So I'm even back there in the altar, and then it's repeating over and over and over again. And then finally I'm like, wait a second, it's repeating because it's trying to tell me something. Like, that's time for all that stuff to go. And we are now ascending into the kingdom, You
knew it was going to take 15 times for you to finally pay attention.
That's right. So yeah, the church and its wisdom, it has to be 15 times. Yeah. So it's like, yeah, so I think it's really, these patterns are so important, and without them, that's what elevates the mind, the imagination, and the heart, and the story. And unless you're living and participating in that bigger narrative, there's really, your life is going to be nothing but totalizing politics or petty grievances.
The institutions of our society are pretty shaky right now. Church attendance is down, right? Religious commitment is down. Marriage is down. Family stability is down, right? the sense of belonging to a place, its clubs, its memberships, the Lions clubs, the Kiwanis, all of that is gone, is down, if not gone, and decimated. So we are adrift and alone as individuals. It's very easy when you're alone and an individual only. Of course, we are individuals, but an individual only, to have the great pincer movement, where on the one hand we have radical isolation and not commitment to others, and statism, which has to swoop in to solve all the problems of being radically isolated without networks of support and community. So the old ideas of neighborhood and place and association, I think, are pretty important to the revitalization of political life. Again, back to the Richard Weaver, bad ideas are pretty bad. I'm not sure that ideas fix everything. It's going to take a little more blood and meat of concrete political life.
Dr. Snell, one of the things that that you point out, or that you and your team point out in editorial, is education, and how this is an issue that we need to be thinking about as conservatives, that we need to have argument about. And you write that, conservative support for school choice, local control, parental rights, and quality of education should continue, along with the defense of free speech and academic freedom. Still, those efforts, however needful, are not adequate. Without a substantive vision of education, no set of skills or outcomes will halt the decline and inequality and inequities of our schools or the faddish obsessions of our universities. And I was interested in sort of hearing from you, what do you think a substantive conservative vision of education is? Because I think you're right. A lot of times we just kind of diminish it to school choice and maybe in some instances classical ed or the great tradition, but that's actually kind of a niche thing in the conservative movement. So
there's all sorts of things that I think are good and praiseworthy, but just not adequate, right? So school choice, I'm all for it. Sign me up. I love that image you get in Tocqueville of Americans willing to experiment in the laboratory of democracy. Let's see a bunch of classical schools. Let's see a bunch of charter schools. Let's see vouchers. Let's see homeschooling. Let's see it all. Some of it won't work especially well. Some of it will come and go. That's okay. Free people educate their children because it is the parents' responsibility and thus right to be the primary educators of their children. You grant permission to the school and to the teachers and to the state to educate your child. You don't need their permission. They don't tell you what to do. You, if you do, give them permission. So we homeschool our kids, right? And other people do what they think is best for their family. I'm all for it. Let's see the laboratory work. I'm all for free speech in the universities. I'm all for viewpoint diversity, right? You need the laboratory of ideas, the clash of ideas being locked together in argument. We have a kind of monolithic viewpoint at many of the universities. So I'm all for there being Hillsdales and Grove Cities and Thomas Aquinas's, right? I'm also all for that study center and this program and directed studies at Yale and this core. Like, let there be little pockets and enclaves between universities and inside universities. But it can't just be, it seems to me, that we just have a wide variety of experiments going on. There has to be some substance to it. I'm all for the great books. I'm all for the canon. I'm all for learning Latin. But again, it's not just that we're going to recover things from the past as if the past itself is sacrosanct or superior, right? So I'm for all of these things. I just don't think they're adequate. I think the genuine content of a conservative education, in addition to all the skills and knowledge and literacy and symbolic forms, like, got to know how to code, got to learn how to read, like, of course, all the skills, got to know logic. In addition to all the skills, I think the core of it is deep, wondrous gratitude and reverence for reality. I think that's the core of a conservative education. That we discover ourselves to be thrown into a world, by which I mean a natural world, but I also mean a political world, an institutional world, a family world, not of our own devising. And despite its many, many failures and flaws and inadequacies, it's incredibly good and the product of untold years and effort, billions of exercises of intelligence and goodwill to get us here. It's incredible. And if we don't begin with gratitude and reverence, we won't have a conservative education. So I think conservative education primarily is an education in the disposition to gratitude.
And that would seem to me to be, I'm curious what the reaction is, because a place like Princeton in particular, given the ideological disposition, and even this past year, you've sort of seen on so many college campuses the ever narrowing sort of the ideological spectrum which is allowed. It seems to me like the vision that you just laid out must be the most compelling, winsome, treasure in the world for a young 18, 19, 20-year-old. Are they hungry for that? Are you seeing any difference and then seeking it out? Or is it, how is that playing out in practice for you?
You know from your work with students that a lot of them right now are incredibly worried about careers and their future. And for good reasons. They're good economic reasons for them to be worried about that. And student loans and the economy. Like, I get it. I get why they're trying to build a career and a resume. Don't begrudge it to them at all. And yet a good number of them will say, somewhat sheepishly, I've gotten into this university, Princeton, Michigan, whatever. I've gotten into this university, and I'm surprised that the quality of education is not what I anticipated. And I'm surprised that it's not lively. It's not lively. A phrase which I've heard a dozen times in the last year is, the emperor has no clothes, about whatever the home institution that the student is studying in. They come to us, I'm sure they come to you for very similar reasons at ISI, because Leon Cass says this somewhere. He sort of, I don't know if he's actually quoting Field of Dreams. I don't think he is, probably isn't, but it's the same sort of notion. If you build it, they'll come. The human condition has not changed. An 18-year-old young man or young woman wants to lead a meaningful life. They want to have purpose. They want to have love. They want their life to make sense. They have been robbed of their cultural patrimony by so much of their educational experience. And if you offer them the cultural patrimony, by which I don't mean catechesis or a sense of here are all the answers, follow out this blueprint for answers, but do you know that there is this enormous conversation of utter staggering intelligence and beauty over a long time of people trying to figure out what a good and meaningful life is. And you're invited to it. And you can think whatever you want about it, because you yourself are responsible in the end for your commitments to a meaningful life. And it's pretty intoxicating if you try it. They sign up. Nothing's changed. I hear from people, sort of bemoaning the young. I don't buy it at all. I think the young have their own temptations and worries, as they've always had. It has its own peculiar flair. I think the young at the moment are just as dynamic and energetic and inclined towards the true and the good and the beautiful as anybody ever has been. I'm pretty bullish about them because their eyes are wide open. They know what deracinated institutions look like, and they're not overly romantic about them. And so they have eyes wide open looking for things which are better. So I'm pretty bullish about them. Not all of them, but a whole lot of them.
That's great. Well, we are too at ISI, so I wholeheartedly endorse that assessment.
Dr. Snell, one question that we ask all of our guests is, do you consider yourself a conservative, and what does that mean? So I'd love to now pose that question to you.
I'm dying to know why you ask that question. Why do you ask everyone if they're a conservative?
Well, I think it comes from a couple different things, but the main one is I think that students who come to ISI are interested in this question. They're interested in thinking deeply about conservatism. And they're not satisfied with some of the other answers they've been given, which are, more wholeheartedly political and less about the tradition and less sort of serious in nature. And so that's one thing. That's one reason. I think the main reason why, at least I think it's important we ask, is because when I was an ISI student, I thought I was a conservative, and then I started reading great books and thought, well, maybe I'm a leftist. And then, I had people at ISI who came to me and offered me good and strong ideas that were convincing. And so I think, we bring our best professors and people who associate with ISI on the podcast. And so I think it's a really good way to show students what it means to think seriously about being conservative.
Yes, I'm a happy, winsome conservative and always have been. what I've understood that to be has changed somewhat from being a young man to a youthful middle-aged man. The way I understand it now is that I'm a conservative because of an insight, and here I'm repeating something I said about education, because of an insight that the world is a good gift to us. Now, I happen to have religious commitments. I think of that in theological ways. I don't think you would have to have religious commitments or think about that theologically, to think that the world is something that is given to us. We find it given to us, and it's good. And we first have a responsibility to maintain the goodness of what's been given to us. The world and its resources, friendships, families, institutions, are all given to us in trust, in stewardship. They're not fundamentally in the end ours. They're given to us in stewardship. The various, what I would think of conservative political implications or policy commitments are derivative from that insight. So because it's given to us and we have it in stewardship, I don't think that we're rationalists, because we don't think the world is open for us to use and manipulate towards some desired end out of keeping with respect for the integrity of what's been given to us. We can't bend it to our will as we wish. And because we're not to bend it to our own wish, well, then of course there are moral commitments, constitutional limits. Because there are those sorts of limits, we cherish liberty, but not as an idol. We cherish liberty because there's a responsibility first. And because there's a responsibility that every man and woman has to be a faithful steward, because they have the responsibility, they then have the freedom and the right to exercise that responsibility. And so we're committed to liberty because of a deeper insight about the goodness and order of the world. We value the markets then because we value liberty and we value responsibility. We value decentralization and federalism and we can disagree prudentially about all of those political implications, like what should immigration patterns be, what should progressive tax rates be or not be, flat tax, like defensive wars, etc. All of those things that we can disagree about prudentially, I think we can disagree about with a deep commitment to the insight that we're here as faithful stewards that begin with obligations. And that we are obliged and weighted with obligation. That's what it means to be a conservative.
Hear, hear. Well, on the note of stewardship, gratitude, and obligation, thank you, Dr. Snell, for joining us today. And if people are interested in seeing more of your work or following you at Public Discourse, where can they find you?
Yeah, the easiest place to look is thepublicdiscourse.com. Or, of course, you can check us out at the Witherspoon Institute, which is winst.org, winst.org. And I hope, of course, that everyone listening is well familiar with ISI and a supporter of yours and your work as well, as indeed I'm grateful for all that you do.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Snell. And upcoming on Conservative Conversations, be on the lookout for episodes with Michael Matheson Miller of the Acton Institute and Don Devine of the Fund for American Studies.
And thanks for listening to Conservative Conversations. If you enjoyed this podcast, please feel free to head over to isi.org/resources to see all the other things that we offer our members, including the Intercollegiate Review, Modern Age, ISI books, and of course this podcast. Thanks again for listening, and don't forget to rate and review, and we'll see you next time on Conservative Conversations with ISI.